amendment be agreed to. The question now is, if the amendment be agreed to, I call the member for Fairfax.
Deputy Speaker, the member for Sydney cannot make her mind up. She can't make her mind up. So her entire speech is sprinkled with the phrase tinkering at the edges. These aren't reforms, they're tinkering at the edges. And then, of course, she paints the picture of the world being turned upside down. Should this very bill, which apparently is just tinkering at the edges, get through the parliament? I think the member for Sydney and the Labor Party need to make their mind up. Is this indeed tinkering at the edges, or is it the Armageddon it is proposing it in fact is? If there was only one thread of consistency in the argument just put by the member for Sydney, it was the suggestion, as unfoolhardy as it is, as foolhardy, I should say, as it is, the suggestion that this bill is coming with cuts. Can I remind the member for Sydney and the Labor Party that funding to tertiary institutions is set to increase from $17 billion up to $21 billion by the end of the forward estimates. Now, when you go from the number 17 to 21, it is actually an increase. An increase, Deputy Speaker. The Labor Party seem to not understand that when money goes up, when you get more of something, that's actually not called a cut. It's not called a cut. But nevertheless, does this government believe we need to ensure that universities are more efficient? Absolutely we do. The Labor Party used to agree with the same principle. And there are indeed economic benefits to this bill, Deputy Speaker, because indeed this bill is a microcosm of the great challenge that Australia faces to maintain the core values and responsibilities of our society at a time when our public finances are indeed in peril. Since John Curtin introduced Commonwealth scholarships in 1940 and improved access to university education, there has been a largely bipartisan commitment to giving every Australian, where possible, the opportunity for the sort of advancement that we hold so dear in our classless, egalitarian society. And despite differences, that effort is ongoing. Sir Robert Menzies, throughout his record-breaking 16 years as Prime Minister, was perhaps Australia's greatest champion of tertiary education by providing far greater student access to university. This imperative was an abiding preoccupation for Menzies, central to his entire approach to leadership and his vision for Australia. Sir Robert greatly increased the number of universities and significantly expanded the scholarship system to open up access for many hard-working students, irrespective of their wealth or privilege. It was Menzies who brought in tax breaks for education expenses and for living allowances. In 1939, Australia had just 6 universities and just over 14,000 students. By 1966, the year that Menzies stepped down as Prime Minister, there were 16 universities and over 90,000 tertiary students. Gough Whitlam, in 1973, went much further by removing all direct course costs for tertiary students, at least in terms of fees, although the cost of living for students, a cost largely falling on parents, remained a significant burden and meant that there was no great expansion of opportunity, despite what Whitlam may have hoped for. Bear in mind that 1973 was still a time when the great majority of high school students did not matriculate. John Dawkins, author of the so-called Dawkins Revolution in the late 1980s, made massive changes to the higher education sector. Not all of them universally praised, including introducing, as a measure to help protect the budget, what was then known as HECS, the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. Fees were reintroduced and were paid in part by loans to students, with the funds passed on to the universities, and which covered some of the costs of their degrees, and only had to be repaid as they entered employment and achieved higher income levels, which then often triggered only modest repayments. That system has been maintained ever since, Deputy Speaker. It underwent tweaks in the later years of the Hawke and Keating governments and under the Howard government, yet it remains a cornerstone of the system today, as does the philosophy behind it, which was to relieve the taxpayer of total responsibility for the provision of a university education and to ensure that the principal beneficiary, the student, bore a proportion of the cost of their academic betterment. The view in the late 1980s, as it is today, is that the major beneficiary of a university education is indeed the student. A tertiary degree opens the potential, if not always the reality, of achieving an income greater than would ordinarily be possible for a person without that level of education. And in broad terms, that remains the case today. The last major change was in 2012, when the Commonwealth removed caps on the number of places that universities could offer, which in turn took the cap off student loans. The result was an explosion in the number of students and an almost exponential increase in HECS debt owed to the Commonwealth. There are now 1.4 million university students, up 100,000 over the past 3 years alone, attending 39 universities. 39. There are almost 1 million students doing bachelor degrees, over 300,000 in postgraduate courses and more than 65,000 doing postgraduate research. There are over 120,000 staff, significantly more than there were only 50 years before. Today, our HECS debt has ballooned to an astonishing $50 billion. $50 billion. And that debt, tied up in loans to students, is expected to grow even more dramatically in the years ahead, as increasing numbers of students rush to take advantage of uncapped Commonwealth loans and almost unfettered tertiary access. The positives of this serial, steady, generally bipartisan expansion of opportunity are many. The first is that access has been continuously, incrementally and even exponentially since the Curtin and Menzies years extended to the sorts of levels that fit our national commitment to a classless and egalitarian society. Over the decade to 2015, for example, there was a 50% increase in the number of students from lower socio-economic status backgrounds attending university. There was a 45% increase in the number of regional and remote students, from just over 100,000 in 2008 to almost 160,000 in 2015. There were just over 7,000 Indigenous students in university in 2008, but over 12,000 in 2015, while the number of people with disabilities going to university was up an astonishing 94%, from 24,000 to over 47,000. 37% of Australian 25 to 34-year-olds now have a bachelor's degree or higher, and the Australian university sector has become an extraordinary contributor to the national economy. In 2001, there were just over 150,000 foreign students paying full fees here to study. There are now over 350,000, mainly from North East and Southeast Asia, and this generates export income that is third only behind iron ore and coal, an extraordinary achievement, almost $22 billion in 2015-16. Australia is now, and has been for some time, one of the leading international providers of tertiary education. These are outstanding outcomes from a great deal of effort, but there are also some equally outstanding problems, Deputy Speaker. The 2012 uncapping of entry, such that universities now decide how many students they enrol without the need to meet government-imposed quotas, means that at least some universities have dropped their standards in the grasp for dollars. From students and from taxpayers, who continue to foot most of the bill, which has increased by 71% since 2009. People are being enrolled whose entrance scores for some disciplines are so low that the potential for them to successfully complete their chosen course is likewise very low, and the universities know it. Clear evidence of this is a dropout rate of about 1 in 3, a tremendous waste of time for the student and an equally tremendous waste of resources, including precious taxpayer dollars, bearing in mind that upwards of 80% of the cost of many degrees continues to be borne by the taxpayer. There is also a lot of wasted effort, Deputy Speaker, and resources for students enrolling in courses where the opportunity for employment once they have their degrees often varies from limited to virtually non-existent. And the universities enrolling students for these courses know that too, and if they don't, well, they should. These are clear flaws in the system, unintended consequences, if you like, of a rampant self-regulation that we simply can no longer afford. And this bill, it is hoped, will go some way to correcting such flaws in the interest of students, universities and the economy, not to mention, of course, in the interests of the taxpayer. Members opposite, in signalling opposition to at least some of the measures in this bill, are simply continuing their long, ubiquitous flight over the cuckoo's nest, just as they still flap away in relation to their fake commitment to Gonski, the disability insurance scheme and their mad plan for 50% renewables by 2030. Labor has no plan to fix this, and they certainly have no money while the public debt is now at $500 billion, $500 billion, and headed upwards of $700 billion on the trajectory they established with their spendthrift ways when they were last in government. And via their relentless opposition now, and ever since they were booted from office in 2013, to stymie each and every attempt by this government to rein in debt, preserve our AAA credit rating and restore our budget to balance. Australia simply cannot afford more nonsense from those opposite, whether across the board or in relation to the crucial goal of ensuring a university system that is sustainable, is fair and is transparent. The key measure in this bill is a 1.8% increase each year for the next 4 years in the share of the cost of university education that is borne by students. Cumulatively, a 7.5% increase by 2021, with the Commonwealth contribution reduced by the same amount. We cannot afford more. This bill is driven by the same imperative that drove John Dawkins and Neville Wran, who was a key advisor to Dawkins, and Bob Hawke in 1988 when they reintroduced fees and established HECS, and that is the budget. These are still very, very competitive arrangements for our students. In New Zealand, graduates pay 12 cents in every dollar they earn, over $17,500. In the United Kingdom, graduates pay 9% of their income once their income reaches the equivalent of $36,000. In Australia, the new threshold set by this bill is $42,000 and the minimum repayment is 1%, or just $8 a week, and only slightly more for higher income earners. That is, by international standards, Deputy Speaker, extremely generous, and I'm confident it will pass any fair-minded pub test in any part of this country. Other important measures in the bill will ensure that universities are more open, more transparent, more responsive to students by giving them clearer information about the prospects of employment at the completion of their course. And there will be expanded support for sub-degree courses to reflect the reality that, for many students, a diploma or certificate course could serve them and their community better than attempting a degree. This is indeed a very sensible and positive move. It continues the historic, generally bipartisan, effort in this country to enable those who want to achieve a university education to obtain it, regardless of their wealth, social standing or background. We are very deliberately, even fiercely, a classless, egalitarian society. That attitude, typically supported by Australian governments, recognises and reflects the core values of the Australian people. This bill advances that cause, but also recognises, as it did by the mentors or the members opposite back in the late 1980s that budgetary pressures are real and have to be responded to. It is for these reasons, Deputy Speaker, that I am delighted to commend this bill to the House.
All right, thank you, member for Fairfax. Questions.